Hi everyone, welcome to After Dark Analysis. I started the homosexuality and horror series on Psycho. In hindsight, I should have started it with this episode. This will be kind of a massive crash course, cliff notes on queer coding in film to give you all a foundation for the rest of the series. Yes, I understand queer coding is still a controversial term because, let's face it, it's a reappropriated slur. But that is the term that's been accepted academically, therefore what I will be using, because a lot of people like to research things, and that will make your searches a lot easier. In terms of film, queer coding and queer theory are relatively new on the scene. It only got accepted academically a few decades ago. Unfortunately, that was mostly spurned by the AIDS crisis, but the history of it goes way back. For simplicity's sake, we're going to start at the Hays Codes. To give an idea of how strict the Hays Codes were, the film Miracle on 34th Street was controversial because the mother was divorced. The Hays Codes are why in old films you'll see a couple go into a bedroom and sleep on two different twin beds. They didn't want any kind of representation in film. Most of these fell under the rule barring deviant sexual acts, which is exactly where they put homosexuality. Like many things, though, pretending like it doesn't exist doesn't make it cease to exist. And filmmakers were all too happy to just start slipping in gay characters any which way they could to protect themselves from prosecution or having their film not put out. Set the stage for a lot of homosexual characters being buried in a lot of innuendo and layers. And while there are very few slam dunks because every filmmaker did it slightly different, there are a lot of keys and clues that we see even in film today. Slightly before the Hays Codes in America, we had the Great Depression. This put a lot of able-bodied men out of work. And at the time period, a man was supposed to work to support his family. Not doing so, even through no fault of his own, was emasculating. So to rechannel and refocus that emasculation, we started to see the male sissy character. This was a man who was artistic and sensitive, which are considered more feminine qualities. Making him less of a man makes him gay. This is going to be the logic train we're dealing with. Originally, these characters would either be dressed very gaudy, typically wearing makeup, or very well in a nice suit, typically having the quote-unquote gay speech. One thing to note is the documentary Do I Sound Gay?, which at the time of this recording is currently streaming on Hulu, tries to track down and identify what it is that makes men sound gay. What they found out was the gay sound seems to be characterized by long S's, long vowels, and over-enunciation, which is typically more of a feminine speaking pattern. They even point out a lot of young gay men have to undergo speech therapy for a lisp, even though it isn't actually a lisp. If you're looking for an example of this type of dialogue, they use a Buddy Cole skit from the show Kids in the Hall. But a slightly more modern example would be The Producers, specifically the Keep It Gay scene. Or in Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, when Titus Andromedon attempts to go to an acting coach to help him act more manly. In addition to the speaking pattern and the visual clues, there are a few phrases that are often used to hint and point the audience at this character might be homosexual without explicitly saying it or showing anything to indicate that. Some of these phrases are confirmed bachelor, light in the loafers, pretty boy, a man who makes his own luck, and there is a very long-standing trope of him being overly attached to his mother. It's way more socially acceptable to not be married or with a woman because your mother doesn't think anybody's good enough than it is to admit that you're attracted to the same sex. This overattachment to their mother also explains a lot of the qualities that we associate with the sissy character archetype. In the late 30s, it's hard to tell if this was the Hays Code loosening or filmmakers just getting bolder. We started to see slightly more blatant portrayals of homosexuality. But the character always had to be villainous, mentally ill, unstable for some reason, or just overall a not likable character. The reason being, to show that kind of deviancy must be the result of either mental illness or have a terrible consequence, because how dare you be attracted to somebody of the same sex? The Hays Code let these things through because it was showing the quote-unquote downfall of the homosexual character, or that you clearly had to be mentally ill to become homosexual. Again, while these beliefs might sound dated, it does still influence the homosexual character we see on film today, playing off of, into, or in spite of the homosexual equals criminal logic. We start to see a lot more transparent villains. Hitchcock, for example, loved using this. Obviously, we're going to skip Psycho. Another good example, though, is the film Rope. The film is about friends who kill a fellow classmate because they believe they are superior to him. The thing about Rope is it takes place literally right after the murder. Our opening shot is the boy dying. So we don't see how the two main characters acted before. Being involved in a violent crime's going to bond people whether they want it to or not. The arguments between the two characters read a lot more like an old married couple bickering. The two killers were also based off real-life murderers, Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, who were lovers. This factored in with that Hitchcock absolutely loved to give the finger to the Hays Code. It's pretty obvious what he was going for. Some bolder examples come from some pretty surprising places. The 1933 film Queen Christina, which starred Greta Garbo, who was no small name to acting at the time, and produced by MGM. The thing is, Queen Christina's bisexuality is historical fact, so any filmmaker attempting to do a biopic about her can't circumvent her love life. They slipped in a very friendly relationship with her lady-in-waiting. There is a scene where they kiss, and it's a little longer and more intimate than you typically see with a friend. They also slid in a scene where her and a male companion had clearly just finished having sex. Even though they're clothed, they're still in bed together. Luckily, MGM was willing to stand behind the film. They fought to the point where it went to a board of producers where it did win, because most films that ended up there did pass through. Well, yeah, they were governed by the Hays Code. These were producers that had some inkling of what sold, what didn't, and what things cost to make. So to stay in good graces with MGM, of course they're going to let it through. The next year, in 1934, Warner Brothers produced a film called Wonder Bar. The big objectionable scene in here is there's a big dance going on. A man taps a couple dancing on the shoulder and says, "May I cut in?" The female, assuming it's for her, says sure, but the man who tapped her on the shoulder begins to dance with the male partner she was with. She walks off, and the band director who saw what happened simply says, "Boys will be boys." While we are in much more innocent and less jaded times, some things just don't require more explanation. The horror film The Invisible Man is often pointed to as an example of this as well. We have a character who cannot be seen, tries to find a male partner in crime, and then becomes visible again after being killed by police. The allegory becomes clear when we're looking at a group that was marginalized and arrested for just being who they were. When we talk about how this shapes modern film, many of us grew up on Disney. Characters like Captain Hook and Peter Pan, Jafar in Aladdin, Scar in The Lion King, Ursula in Little Mermaid, and countless others I'm not even going to try and list. All of them were viewed to have a very feminized speaking pattern. Obviously Ursula, because she is female, but Ursula was based directly off of Divine, who, for reference sake, was in the original Hairspray. If you've only seen the remake, that's who John Travolta's character was based off of. When we look at something like X-Men, again, we're looking at a marginalized group. We have a class of people whose powers begin to express in adolescence, much like most people's sexuality, and they're trying to find their place in the world. While some might consider just that alone to be a tenuous connection, most teens are awkward and don't feel like they fit in. When you factor in there are laws trying to either outlaw, exterminate, or severely limit what the X-Men can and cannot do, considering the Hays Code is literally a representation of that. At one point, a parent even says to their child, "Have you tried not being a mutant?" And as many a nasty coming out story can tell you, that's not uncommon. A lot of people asking, how do you know? Have you tried not being gay? Have you tried being with somebody of the opposite sex? You haven't found the right woman, man, etc., etc. Those are still very common reactions to people coming out. Broad strokes out of the way, I want to deep dive into two different films. The first being Suddenly Last Summer from 1959. In the 1950s, the Hays Code adjusted. It now allowed small hints of homosexuality if they supplied comic relief or the sexual deviant paid for their crime. Really just giving filmmakers permission to do what they were doing anyway. While Suddenly Last Summer, released in 1959, it takes place in 1937. This film mostly centers around the death of the main character, Sebastian. It's a little weird to call him a main character because he's barely in the film at all, but his death is the cornerstone which every other event in the film is based off of. We quickly learn that Sebastian was incredibly well off and very attached to his mother. He died while on vacation with his cousin. She apparently witnessed what happened, but blocked it out. So they've sent her off to an asylum to try and get better and potentially remember what happened. A doctor comes in to work with her because he is very good at performing the very new and radical procedure of lobotomies. Yeah, 37. So while he's trying to help her remember, there is this deadline looming. If they can't get it out of her, she will be lobotomized and probably never remember. Another thing to note is there seems to be kind of skewed perceptions on any kind of sexuality in this film. His cousin Catherine tells the story of a gardener making some pretty severe advances towards her that she was not into, and when she attempted to report it, it was turned around that she was flirting with him. Some form of sexual assault was heavily implied, but it seemed like the nurses at the institution she was in wanted to perceive it more as she's a nymphomaniac that can't control her sexual urges, whereas Catherine was, no, this guy forced himself on me, I was not willing. The relationship between Sebastian and his mother keeps coming up throughout the entire film. When the surgeon first meets her, he's impressed by how young she is. She comments that if a son loses their parents, they're an orphan. If a woman loses her husband, she's a widow. But there's no word in the English language strong enough for a mother losing her child. Through his mother, it's revealed that Sebastian was completely obsessed with horticulture, the arts, poetry. He actually died on a once-a-year trip him and his mother typically took, so he could write his one poem a year. It turns out this was the first year Sebastian went with his cousin. She refers to a trip they took to the Galapagos. Apparently Sebastian timed it so that they would see the turtles mating and then come back when they were hatching. If you've ever seen a turtle hatching, it's normally swarmed by predatory birds. She launches into a story where she talks about how Sebastian made her watch these predatory birds attacking these tiny turtles. No matter how much she tried to move her head away and say she didn't want to see it, he wouldn't allow her to look away. And she will make reference heavily to predatory birds and predatory plants. Once the mother and the doctor have familiarized themselves with each other, and she feels comfortable with him working with Catherine, they go inside to enjoy a daiquiri, which her and her son used to have at the same time every day. Come to find out her nephew and sister are in there. The reason this is important is because her nephew is taking all of Sebastian's old clothes because he's going off to college and couldn't afford something as nice as Sebastian had, and goes on and on and on about his impeccable taste in fashion. And men being into fashion is stereotypically gay. When the doctor goes to see Catherine at the mental institution, it's compounded upon that she has some kind of sexual deviancy. He does a Rorschach test with her with shadows on the wall, and she says it's her losing her honor. Given the tone and context, very obvious that honor is a euphemism for virginity. She talks about a Mardi Gras prom where she ended up getting a ride from a guy she didn't really know. While they're driving along, she points out he's kind of going the wrong way. He says they're going to go park. Dealing with dated terminology and slang, going to park means they were going to park in a secluded area and have some kind of intimate contact. Once they're done parking, he drives her back home, but mentions he's married, a fact Catherine did not know. She ends up going back to this dance under the pretenses that she's going to get her coat that she left behind. In reality, she sees him and chews him out. making a big, huge scene, which again didn't help her reputation, because now you essentially outed, not only did she sleep with somebody out of wedlock, she slept with a married man. They end up transferring her to his hospital. It is insisted upon that she's allowed to have her hair done and dress normally, not as a patient, and being held in the nurse's wing. The hope and idea here being if she returns to some kind of normalcy, it might jog her memory and she no longer feels like a patient, she feels like just a person. During all this, her mother and brother come to visit. The mother comments on how fantastic her dress is. She says that Sebastian got it for her in Paris, and George is wearing one of his suits. Again, fashion. And having an eye specifically for women's fashion. Her mother stresses the fact that she lied to the community. Everybody believes she's on an extended vacation and not in a mental hospital. This is also where it's revealed that Sebastian's mother, aka Aunt Violet, has offered everybody $50,000 for her to get a lobotomy. At this point, Aunt Violet is convinced Sebastian died of a heart attack. Catherine knows deep down this isn't true, but since the memory is repressed, and it does seem legitimately repressed, not like she's trying to deceive anybody, or trying to drag Sebastian's name through the mud, because it's very obvious that they were close and loved each other very much. So she can't prove it. The lobotomy is going to erase any trace of this. Sebastian died of a heart attack. That's going to be the end of the story. Obviously, they want her to take the money. Her brother George even describes it as having your tonsils out, which in no way, shape, or form in any kind of universe is true. Obviously upset and freaked out over what just happened, she runs. Since she doesn't know the layout of the hospital very well, she ends up getting trapped on kind of a catwalk over top where the patients are kept, which is just one big common room. And this is being noted because this comes back later. She's pulled by the doctor. Her mother lies and says, I don't know why she ran. Obviously, she knows why Catherine ran, just doesn't want to admit what she's doing or why she's doing it. So obviously, they know the difference between right and wrong. They just simply don't care in this instance. They take her back to her room and heavily sedate her. While the sedation's kicking in, she begins to babble on and on and on about Sebastian. Specifically how he was done with the light ones and famished with the dark ones. He spoke of them like food, and he was living on pills and salad. She makes this colossal point of never specifying a gender, and we will see this reoccurring with Sebastian. Anytime we're talking about a relationship, platonic or not, outside of family, gender's always left out. Once she wakes up, Aunt Violet is there. She calls her out about the bribe. Violet leaves completely upset. And it's clear that she blames Catherine for Sebastian's death. She had gone with him every single summer. This was the first summer she didn't go with him. He died. Ergo, in her head, Catherine is responsible for Sebastian's death and he wouldn't have died if she was there. Which is kind of weird considering she's trying to convince everybody he died of a heart attack. There's very few ways another human being could push you into having a heart attack. So it becomes very clear that Aunt Violet has her own suspicions and doesn't want confirmation on them. During this discussion, Catherine again vaguely goes on about Sebastian. She talks about how he treated people like objects, and that Kathy was taken along due to her ability to attract, since his mother no longer could. He used them as bait, they procured for him, and made contacts for him. This is not subtle. It's pretty clear what they were doing and why they were going to foreign places to do it. Aunt Violet denies everything and demands the operation be performed, specifically saying they want to cut the truth out of her brain. It's obvious that she knows something is wrong here. She has her suspicions, but she's willing to use any bit of money and power at her disposal to not have those suspicions confirmed. Catherine, obviously upset by all of this, goes out onto the catwalk again. The entire room falls dead silent, and the only sound we hear is one of the patients rocking back and forth in a rocking chair. They kind of move towards her like they're curious, but once she makes her intention clear and climbs over the rail, they begin to hysterically laugh. She's pulled off the catwalk by one of the doctors. It's demanded that the lobotomy be performed tomorrow. After this attempted suicide, while he is the top-ranking surgeon for this, Violet is trying to replace him if he refuses, which he obviously is at this point. Because gonna gloss over this because it's not super important, there is kind of a shoved-in love story between the Doctor and Catherine. He is able to convince all parties involved to give him one more day. They all go to the house, and the mother's clearly upset that they're all there. She hands the Doctor a copy of Sebastian's death certificate. It's in Spanish, and he can translate it, but she offers him a translation of it anyway. It notes that the body was damaged, and when he questions this, she points out, well, a body's going to be damaged when you fall from a heart attack. The coffin was sealed, so they didn't see the body at all, and when he pushes if there were any rumors behind Sebastian's death, she is very adamant there were none. Again, obviously not true, or this entire movie wouldn't have happened. Catherine is given truth serum and hypnotized as a way to attempt to unblock whatever's going on in her head. She talks about how Sebastian could not write his summer poem. He had it dated, he had the notebook, and just couldn't get it out of him. There's some very obvious guilt. She says that she failed him and couldn't keep the web from breaking. Then begins to tell a story about how they would go to the beach every day. His mother immediately objects and says he wouldn't go to a public beach. She points out that they went to a paid beach right next to the public beach. And they do show flashbacks to this. The way they're divided is by a chain link fence that you could pretty easily get around. She talks about the day that Sebastian forced her into a white bathing suit that she was very uncomfortable being with to begin with, because like most white fabrics in water, it becomes transparent. She referred to it as procuring for him, which goes right along with saying they were used as bait and were used to attract. After the day with the white bathing suit, her and Sebastian went their separate ways on the beach every single day. She would meet up with him at the bathhouses. And as he was leaving the bathhouses, he was giving money to the local men. Again, this is not subtle. Cutting to the day of his death, him and Catherine were eating in a restaurant. There were some locals, they keep referring to them as children, but most of them look to be teens or young adults, pushing up against a chain link fence asking for bread. Sebastian goes on and on about how begging is a social disease, and if you look at them, you can get sick of this country. He's also seeming to have some medical issues that day because she says he kept popping pills, so it seems like the heart condition was already known about, and this was probably medication to combat that, hence the excuse of the heart attack. He realizes he knows some of the men, throws money down on the table and says he's not a well man, and runs off with Kathy pursuing him, trying to tell him there's faster ways to get where he wants to go. But he ends up running all over town on white streets during a very hot day, eventually ending up on the top of a hill. The group that has been chasing them completely overtakes him. Kathy sees this, screams, and runs off for help. When they come back, and this is one of the first times we really get to see Sebastian, before it's just kind of, he's there, but he's not really in frame. He's on the top of the hill, dead, with massive chunks of him taken out. The locals that chased him were playing these makeshift instruments out of cans, and she said it basically looked like they were taking cans to scoop bits of him out, and there was some cannibalism. This causes his mother to completely break. She begins to talk to the doctor as if he is Sebastian, and starts going on about how he needs a hat, it's such a warm day, and questions what all the noise is. She goes back inside, and up her little elevator, she talks about birds again, and how they only see the violent side anymore, but it's not like that, no one else knows. The housekeeper just absolutely breaks and runs off crying. It's clear this affects her, and this has some definitely deeper meaning. Another witness says there's every possibility the girl might be telling the truth. And this is where the doctor goes back out, finds Kathy, and they walk off together because they're so in love. Even though they didn't really have any intimacy until like the last 20 minutes, but whatever. And the reason this is one of the films we're going deeper into, because not only is it hitting you over the head with symbolism about Sebastian's sexuality, this movie, intentionally or not, ushered in a serious change in the Hays Code and is historical for that fact. We were still very much in a period of time where you couldn't show quote-unquote deviant sexual acts, which is what everybody hid behind to say you can't show homosexuality or people that are unmarried getting it on. The critics realized it right away. There was no bones about this. There was no subtlety. They just never said the word gay or showed him romantic with another man. Hell, they barely even showed him. One critic was quoted as saying, "Exposed clearly the foremost cause of homosexuality, a mother's emasculation of her son." Because again, being a mama's boy, much more acceptable socially than being gay. So that was often a cover used in film. Another reviewer applauded the death of Sebastian and described it as one of the horrible fates that can overtake a particular kind of sexual pervert. This is where Hayes started allowing you to show a gay character only if you either had them be the villain, mentally ill, or die, preferably as a result of them being gay. Because in this instance, Sebastian would have never been chased down by those men had he not known them. And we're going to go with known as in the carnal or biblical sense. Sebastian's character was this amalgamation of the mama's boy, the rich boy, the cared for, the stylish, the artistic. Every single factor of this character was a gay stereotype, and while the events of the film are spurned because of his death, and mostly revolve around discussions of him, you don't get a whole lot of sense of who Sebastian was. Anything that might be personal or deeply revealed about Sebastian is hidden in the characters doing these long, poetic monologues, hiding things under 5 layers of symbolism. While it's not hard to crack when you're looking at it in context, this was still them attempting to hide that they were showing a gay character. Most people are aware of the second language encoding, even if they don't totally realize it. A very rough and dirty example is The Big Bang Theory with Howard Wolowitz and his mother. While we never really see his mother, she is the overbearing Jewish mother stereotype, and while Wolowitz is straight, but because of the strong relationship with his mother and a strong relationship with a male friend, everybody joked at the beginning of the show that Wolowitz was gay, and him attempting to constantly hit on girl after girl after girl was simply a cover. Kind of like how Sebastian used women he was related to as bait to cover up his own sexuality. I think I've beaten this horse enough. Let's move on. Next, we're going to look at 1970 with The Boys in the Band. Before I even start, I would feel remiss if I didn't state that there are a lot of debates, critically and academically, about this film as to, is the representation of gay men good or bad in it? This was one of the first films of its type where we openly talked about gay men. Poor representation or not does not take away the historic value of this film, and is included because of that. If you feel strongly about the representation being problematic or not, feel free to discuss it in the comments below. That's what they're there for. Now that's out of the way, let's move on. The synopsis reads, tempers fray and true selves are revealed when a heterosexual is accidentally invited to a homosexual party. So they're not hiding it, it's way more upfront, but there's still quite a bit of coding, and this film, again, historically has influenced a lot of things on down the line. We start out with a shopping montage with bright colors, little dogs being walked all around the city. We establish we're in New York. We cut to an apartment with 2 men named Donald and Mike. The friends kind of banter back and forth. It's obvious that they know each other well and are comfortable in each other's presence. As one of them grooms, another one complains about their hair falling out. Another jokes, it doesn't matter what you look like when you masturbate, implying they have no serious relationship. So who are they really keeping themselves up for? One of them even mentions how neurotic the parents are and how overbearing, and even saying how mommy and daddy made their darling to be a little fairy. They go into this kind of joke about show tunes and mock Judy Garland and Bette Davis. Bette Davis is typically considered a big gay icon. Judy Garland starred in Wizard of Oz. Being a friend of Dorothy is an older term meaning gay, as well as the Wizard of Oz overall, because both men start to talk about small town life, leaving where they came from and go to the big city for acceptance, which is essentially the plot to Wizard of Oz. We have a girl from a poor farming town who gets sucked up into a tornado, which takes her to a big city, and she kind of finds herself, has a personal transformation, finally sees she has some potential because, let's face it, Somewhere Over the Rainbow is not a happy song. She's essentially saying, this place sucks and I'm never getting out. While Dorothy ends up going back, clearly these men have found something to make them stay in Oz. Mike receives a call. The phone's been ringing on and off this entire time. They just kind of keep missing it, coming in and out the door because landlines. We find out it's his old roommate from Georgetown, Alan. As far as they know, Alan is 100% straight and has no reason to know that Mike is gay. It's even commented that his parents look down on people in the theater. Theater has all kinds of stereotypes behind it, but this film is specifically adapted from a stage play. So there is that double meaning. Mike swears up and down the entire film that he didn't come out till after college. He gets called out pretty often though, because a lot of these men, it seems like he met in gay bars during college. One even specifically mentions junior year. Because of all this baggage, Mike does not want Alan to come over. Alan breaks down sobbing. The problem is they're having a party for their friend Harold. All of the men in attendance will be gay, and he is worried about the mixing and it becoming problematic. Not only making Alan uncomfortable, but his friends not feeling like they can be themselves in a private space, free from any social pressure about who they are. So as a compromise, he just says, okay, Alan can come over, he'll try and keep him separate from the party, they'll hash whatever they need to hash out, and then he'll leave. During this commotion, pretty much all of the other party guests sans Harold show up. We become aware of Emery's presence because build-wise he's a little smaller than everybody else, but he's very boisterous, he projects, and he comes in calling everybody Mary, which again is an older term for gay. Mike lets them all know his friend will be coming over, but he won't be staying. One of them quips, if he's the one I met, he's straight as the yellow brick road. Many of them kind of talk about their coming out experiences, specifically during college, and many of them chalk the beginnings of it up to Christ was I drunk last night syndrome, which means they'd go out, they'd get drunk, they'd have sex with a man that they were attracted to, but the next morning would go, no, I'm not gay, I was just really drunk last night. To further emphasize this caution, a delivery man is met on the stairs of the apartment complex, not at the actual apartment, where all of the men are joking, carrying on, and doing what most friends do, talking about their love lives, talking about their personal lives, which understandably and reasonably points heavily towards their sexuality. It seems like it's not just avoiding judgment from somebody on the outside, some people having not encountered somebody like that, or putting them on a do not deliver list, or voicing their objection to who they're with, are all possibilities, and it seems like these things are very calculated and done just for safety's sake. Speaking of this issue, Alan just so happens to arrive while all of the men are doing a dance. Alan apologizes for barging in because he clearly knows something's different here, he's just not sure what. He mingles with people a little bit, and he seems immediately drawn to the one guy drinking beer named Hank. Hank talks about how he has 2 kids, and Alan talks about how he has 2 girls and how he's been married for 9 years. This is when Hank mentions he's getting a divorce, the reason for which will be revealed later on. When Alan and Mike go off to chat, Alan immediately starts digging into Emery because he is the embodiment of the gay male stereotype. He's loud, he's boisterous, he dresses well, and he carries himself and talks in an effeminate way. He even says he seems like such a goddamn little pansy. And then kind of sort of apologizes, but presses Mike to admit that Emery's effeminate. And then Alan gives that line that so many people are so used to hearing. I don't care what you do in the privacy of your own home, but not out in the open and shove down everyone's throat. Emery hasn't really done anything that would be horribly inappropriate inside of the environment they're in. They're at a friend's house, waiting to celebrate another friend's birthday. It's not like he's done anything physical or been overly graphic. Just wanting to make it clear where Alan's baseline seems to be is if you seem gay and can't pass, he has a problem. But for one reason or another, Alan won't give up whatever he came to talk to Mike about. As if all of this wasn't enough, a man shows up at the door. He sings happy birthday and then kisses Mike on the mouth. It turns out that this man was hired as a prank. He was supposed to do that to Harold, not Mike, when he answered the door. Luckily, Alan's out of the room for that particular part. The way Mike reacts is that he's shocked that this man came out of nowhere and kissed him. It's not as strong a reaction as you'd expect from a heterosexual male who's been kissed by a complete stranger in the 1970s. As Alan goes to leave, him and Emery get into it, Alan eventually yelling faggot, and they come to blows. During the fight, Harold arrives for his party. They then throw the guy they hired as a prank at Harold. He does the thing again, kisses him, he looks at the card and laughs. Mike does scold him for being both late and high. His retort is he is a 32-year-old, pockmarked June fairy and will do as he wants. Getting that self-deprecation of either trying to stay closeted to certain people or using kind of self-deprecating language to describe yourself. The fight has since broken up, and Emery is freaking out about his split lip bleeding onto his sweater because now his sweater is ruined. Alan doesn't seem apologetic about it either. During all this, Emery also keeps referring to Harold as a she. It's very clear that Harold does not identify as a woman. This is just kind of a joking term. This is a technique Emery uses all throughout the film. He's often referring to people as Fruit, Mary, and any other possible name, which we're going to assume is his coping mechanism. Harold continues to smoke pot and makes a joke about how he no longer hides it in the oregano because his mother always asks for a salad at every meal and he's afraid she's going to grab that by mistake. He also talks about aging and his mother's rabbi. Again, we're getting that very attached to the mother, specifically very attached to the Jewish mother trope. During all of this, the good-natured ripping between Mike and Harold starts to get kind of mean. Mike calls him out on how many pills he takes. He points out the pockmarks are due to him taking tweezers to his face, and that he also starves himself to gorge in one meal and complains he's fat. While men are not averse to body image issues, they are stereotypically more feminine concerns. It's also heavily insinuated that the pills are for suicide, not for recreational or any kind of weight loss. It's even said, I'm sorry, this is a direct quote, not all faggots off themselves at the end of the story. The reasons I'm pointing this particular line out, not only is it one of the most famous lines from this movie, it is a very blunt callback to the dead gay trope, which we saw in Suddenly Last Summer. It's okay if you're gay as long as you get punished in some way for it, most preferably death. With this film coming out so close to the end of Hays Laws, and being so open about it, it makes that line very reactionary, showing the massive issues and the societal perceptions that were created under the Hays Code, knowingly or not. Believe it or not, Alan is still there, and it starts to rain. Alan goes to leave, but they block the doorway, saying he's never going to get a cab in this. Might as well just stay. There also could be some just outside hope of making Alan understand this, under the logic that Alan knows Mike and thinks he's a good guy, so if Mike's a good guy and gay, how can all gay people be bad? While all the men are sitting in the living room to avoid the rain, it's suggested that they play a game. The rules being, you call the one person you truly love and tell them you love them. Since this takes up the majority of the film's runtime, I'll try and be as succinct as possible, while still giving a sense of each individual person that's represented here. The one that offers to go first is Bernard, and the reason you haven't heard that name before is he's been extremely quiet all throughout the film. The big identifying factor for him is he is the only black man there. He said the first person he loved was the son of the family his mother was a laundress for. At one point they did get drunk at a swimming party and did have sex, pretended to forget the next day, doing the aforementioned man was I drunk last night syndrome. He calls the number, but doesn't get the guy, but he is aware that he's separated from his third wife. This hammers home the big contradiction against what we were seeing under Hays. The belief was if you are heterosexual, wait to have sex till marriage and marry within your own race. Because interracial relationships were a huge issue at the time as well. You will be happy. But in this guy's case, clearly not. This is the third time. And something's not right here. You can theorize that the night with Bernard wasn't forgotten and wasn't really an accident. but that's just a theory the audience can deduce off what little information they have. Emery is up next. He calls information and asks for Delbert plots, and says while they're connecting him, I wish information would stop calling me ma'am. A hark back to that quote-unquote gay effeminate sound. He met him when he was in 5th grade, and Delbert was a senior. But after high school, he became a dentist, so Emery would go get his teeth cleaned, try and flirt with him. But he was engaged to what he described as a truly awful girl. During this time period, he called him and asked to see him alone. He blurted out that he wanted to be his friend, and when Delbert agreed, he gave him a gold-plated lighter with his initials in it. The problem was he went to a school dance that the guy's fiancée was at, and she told everyone what he had done and how weird he was. Emery states what they didn't know was I loved him. Given his emotional reaction and age at the time, it seems like this was his first big love, and the fact that it was not reciprocated still hurts. To the point where he starts to cry, which again is much more stereotypically feminine. Whole big blow up because Mike's been drinking. We find out Mike's kind of a jerk and doesn't necessarily treat his friends very well. He actually pushes Emery over at one point when he tries to say he's drunk. It's also revealed that Larry and Hank are a couple. Larry keeps cheating on Hank. It's even said that he is not the marrying type. Thinking back to a phrase like lifelong bachelor, the connection's much easier to see. Alan completely thought Hank was straight, because not only does he look and have the mannerisms of a stereotypically heterosexual male, he mentioned the marriage. Come to find out that he left his wife for Larry. It's explained as he swings both ways, but with a decided preference. When questioned about if he would be so accepting if Hank had left his wife for another woman, he says that's normal, but what you're doing is disgusting. Once again, showing his bias. He's fine if you leave the confines of marriage for somebody of the opposite sex. In the midst of trying to explain how a man leaves a woman for another man, and all of the issues with fidelity that they clearly have, Hank calls their apartment complex. The front desk answers. He leaves a message for Larry saying, I love you. Because again, rules of the game. Larry flips shit because it's made abundantly clear that everybody in that complex still thinks they are roommates. It's even joked about saying no man has a roommate after 30. So Hank just outed them to at least the one member of the complex staff. And a huge problem with him doing that is we're in 1970. The laws were nowhere near where they are now, and even now they're not that great. As of 2007, only 17 states have outlawed discrimination against people who identify themselves as gay, lesbian, or transgender. New York is one of them, but at the time, those protections didn't exist at all. Larry and Hank could have easily been kicked out for that. But after Larry's initial knee-jerk reaction, he uses Mike's phone to call Mike's apartment to tell Hank he loves him. Because like a lot of relationships, there are some deep-rooted issues that need to be worked out, and it's clear that they're both in it for the long haul. By this point, Mike's kind of directed his rage at all of his friends, and now it's Alan's turn. He calls him out on calling Emery a freak and a pansy, and jokes that at least he didn't call him a sodomite. Then he calls out that Alan slept with a guy named Justin in college. Mike talks about how he always spoke about Justin and how they were attached at the hip and everything was Justin this, Justin that. When Alan denies it, he tells him Justin came into the city and told him everything. It's even pointed out that Alan's wife, Fran, heard the rumors about Alan's possible sexuality. By this point, Harold's sick of it and digs back into Mike, saying you'll be homosexual till the day you die. Everybody kind of starts clearing out. The rains calm down a bit. Everybody's been digging at raw wounds, and it's just uncomfortable. Between the drinking and just him kind of being a jerk to everybody, Mike has a complete breakdown. Donald offers him a Valium just to try and calm him down. He attempts to grab the whole bottle from him. Donald prevents this. And he says, I'm tired of living, but I'm scared to die. Mike then says what is undebatably the most famous line from this film. Show me a happy homosexual, and I'll show you a gay corpse. Hitting back to all of the problems with staying closeted, or even when you're open, all of the bashing and issues you're going to come against. The film really ends on the obvious symbolism of them looking over a destroyed and flooded out party on their deck. And then the line, "As my father said, dying in my arms, I don't understand it. I don't understand any of it." As stated before, this film is controversial in the way it chose to represent things. The obvious thing that can be taken, though, is it was so over the top because it was a reaction to the Hays Code. People spending all this time not really seeing themselves represented on screen, and now they could be shown. The pendulum's gonna swing hard the other way and kind of show problems the Hays Code created. Like most things, learning to interpret certain things can give you a deeper understanding of the character. Having an idea of some of the phrasing and references and callbacks helps deduce this a little bit, but it's normally completely based on context. So I said very rarely is there a slam dunk. So while I know this is a much longer episode than I normally do, this was the only way I could think to try and give a crash course and give enough information for people to decode and start to dissect themselves. These two films were chosen just because the examples are so on the surface. You don't have to dig super hard down to figure out what's going on. So while we're long out of Hays Code, and there's no real rule or governing body saying you can't show a gay character, there's still major issues with representation and what's shown, what's not shown. How do we make a good representation? Do we need to make a good representation? Will this play in middle America to the kid that doesn't even realize this is a thing, either because they're too sheltered or because they don't know anybody else that feels like them? Rarely under as many layers as it used to be, it is still there, and there are still callbacks to coding, either as a nod or a tribute to filmmakers that were willing to circumvent that system, or because some people feel that's the only way to slide it in for certain demographics. So as always, if you like what you're hearing, please hit like, comment, subscribe. If you don't like what you're hearing, please leave me a comment and let me know.